December 3rd, 1942. A cramped conference room deep within Combined Operations Headquarters, Richmond Terrace, London. The air hangs thick with cigarette smoke and the metallic scent of cold rain seeping through blackout curtains. Around a battered oak table sit 7 men in various military uniforms, their faces drawn, their patience thinning. Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten, Chief of Combined Operations, leans back in his chair, fingers drumming against the armrest. Across from him, Air Vice Marshal John Slessor shifts uncomfortably, his eyes fixed on the peculiar figure now rising to speak. Geoffrey Pike stands slowly, his tall frame unfolding like a carpenter's rule. His suit hangs loose on his angular body, creased and ill-fitting. Behind thick-rimmed spectacles, his eyes burn with an intensity that makes several officers straighten in their seats. He places both palms flat on the table, leaning forward. "Gentlemen," Pike begins, his voice surprisingly soft, almost conspiratorial, "I propose we build aircraft carriers from ice." The room erupts, not with laughter, not yet, but with sharp intakes of breath, the scraping of chairs, muttered exclamations. Group Captain Edwards snorts audibly. Mountbatten raises one hand for silence, though the corner of his mouth twitches with what might be amusement or disbelief. Pike doesn't flinch. He's accustomed to this reception. For months, he's been the resident eccentric at Combined Operations, a civilian scientist with wild hair and wilder ideas, brought in by Mountbatten himself to think the unthinkable. His previous proposals have ranged from the brilliant to the bizarre: snow vehicles for commando raids in Norway, schemes to assassinate Mussolini, plans to airlift entire armies across Europe. Some have been implemented, others filed away in folders marked unconventional warfare, extremely confidential. This idea, though, this one dwarfs them all. Not ordinary ice, Pike continues, reaching into a worn leather satchel beside his chair. A composite material, ice reinforced with wood pulp. He produces a small block, roughly the size of a brick, and slides it across the polished wood toward Mountbatten. The Americans have a researcher, a man named Max Perutz, working at Cambridge now, refugee from Austria. Brilliant crystallographer. He's discovered that when you freeze water mixed with approximately 14% wood pulp, you create something extraordinary. Mountbatten picks up the block, weighing it in his hand. It's surprisingly dense, cloudy white with tiny fibres visible within its structure. Cold radiates through his palm. "This material," Pike says, his voice gaining momentum, "has compressive strength approaching that of concrete. It melts far more slowly than ordinary ice. And most remarkably," he pauses, meeting each man's eyes in turn, "it's virtually unsinkable and impervious to torpedo damage." Air Vice Marshal Slessor leans forward now, interest flickering behind his skepticism. "Impervious how, exactly?" "Show them," Mountbatten says quietly. He's heard portions of this pitch before, in private. He's seen preliminary demonstrations. What intrigues him isn't just the material, it's the problem it solves. Pike nods to a young lieutenant stationed by the door. The man disappears briefly, returning with what appears to be a small-caliber service revolver and several additional blocks of the mysterious substance. He arranges them on a side table alongside blocks of ordinary ice for comparison. "Standard ice first," Pike announces. The lieutenant raises the weapon, fires. The crack of the gunshot makes everyone jump. The ice block explodes, fragmenting into dozens of glittering shards that scatter across the floor. "Now," Pike says, "the composite." The second shot rings out. This time, the bullet penetrates the surface. They can all see the entry hole, but the block remains intact. No explosion, no fragmentation. Just a neat puncture and a spiderweb of tiny cracks radiating outward, the structure holding firm. The room has gone completely silent. Pike allows the moment to settle before continuing. "I call it Pike-Crete," he says, and there's no false modesty in his voice, just matter-of-fact presentation. "The name is courtesy of my colleagues at Cambridge. The material can be manufactured anywhere with access to ice, water, wood pulp and refrigeration. Which brings us to the strategic picture. He moves to a large map of the Atlantic pinned to the wall, his finger tracing the convoy routes from North America to Britain. Lifelines choked with merchant vessels, stalked by wolf packs of German U-boats. Red pins mark recent sinkings. There are too many. The Battle of the Atlantic, Pike says, and everyone in the room knows the gravity of those words. We're losing, not quickly, but steadily. The gap. His finger circles the mid-Atlantic, that vast expanse beyond the range of land-based aircraft. This is where we're most vulnerable. Here, our convoys have no air cover. U-boats operate with near impunity. We need aircraft carriers to close this gap, but steel carriers take 2 years to build, require massive industrial capacity, and we simply don't have enough of them. Group Captain Edwards clears his throat. So your solution is to build them from ice. From pykrete, Pike corrects, and not build them precisely, freeze them, shape them. The Atlantic Ocean itself becomes our construction yard, our dry dock, our material supply. We need only water and wood pulp, both abundant and cold, which the North Atlantic provides for free 9 months of the year. He returns to the table, pulling rolled blueprints from his satchel, spreading them across the surface. The other officers lean in despite themselves. The drawings show something massive, absurdly massive. A vessel 2,000 feet long, 300 feet wide, with a hull 200 feet deep. Flight deck, hangars, workshops, all carved and constructed from this reinforced ice. Project Habakkuk, Pike announces. The name comes from the biblical prophet, from a verse Pike has quoted repeatedly in his proposal. Regard and wonder marvellously, for I will work a work in your days which ye will not believe. Mountbatten studies the blueprints with growing fascination. The specifications are staggering. This single vessel would displace nearly 2 million tons, roughly 40 times the displacement of HMS Queen Elizabeth, Britain's largest battleship. It could carry hundreds of aircraft. The proposed hull thickness, 40 feet of pykrete, would render it effectively immune to torpedo attack. And the construction cost, Pike insists, would be a fraction of a conventional carrier. The refrigeration system, Commander Thompson speaks up for the first time, pointing to intricate piping drawn throughout the vessel's cross-section. How do you prevent melting in warmer waters? Self-contained cooling, Pike explains, animated now, feeding off their engagement. Electric motors driving compressors, pumping refrigerant through a network of pipes embedded in the pykrete itself. The ship generates its own power, maintains its own structure. In Arctic waters, the system hardly runs at all. In the Atlantic, it operates at partial capacity. Even in the event of battle damage, the redundancy is built in. You'd have to destroy the entire refrigeration grid to threaten the vessel's integrity, and with 40 feet of hull thickness, that's virtually impossible. Air Vice Marshal Slessor is making calculations on a notepad. Construction time. 6 months, Pike says. Perhaps 8 for the first prototype. After that, once we perfect the technique, we could produce one every 3 to 4 months. The implications settle over the room like snow. If this works, if this mad scheme actually works, it could fundamentally alter the course of the Atlantic War. Air cover across the entire convoy route. U-boats forced to surface and face aerial attack anywhere in the ocean. The stranglehold on Britain's supply lines broken. You understand, Mountbatten says carefully, that this is the most outlandish proposal that's ever crossed my desk, and I've seen some extraordinary things. I understand perfectly, Pike replies. I also understand that we're fighting a war of industrial production against enemies with superior resources. Conventional thinking produces conventional ships using conventional materials, steel, aluminum or rubber, all in desperately short supply. We cannot outproduce the Germans through conventional means. We can only outthink them. He picks up the pykrete block again, holding it aloft. This costs pennies per tonne. Steel costs pounds. This requires minimal skilled labour. We can freeze these vessels using workers who have never set foot in a shipyard. Steel carriers demand thousands of highly trained shipwrights, welders, engineers, men we desperately need elsewhere. Mountbatten exchanges glances with Slessor. There's a language in those looks, a shared understanding born from years of military service, from watching brilliant plans crumble and desperate gambles succeed. The war has taught them that orthodoxy is a luxury Britain can no longer afford. "I'll take this to Churchill," Mountbatten says finally, "and to the Chiefs of Staff. But I want a working demonstration first, a prototype, something substantial enough to prove the concept beyond laboratory samples." Pike's face remains composed, but his hands grip the edge of the table. "How substantial?" "Large enough to support several men, large enough to demonstrate structural integrity, thermal properties, resistance to damage. Something we can shoot at, set fires on, generally abuse." Mountbatten's smile is grim. "If you want to convince the Prime Minister to build a 2-million-tonne ice ship, Mr. Pike, you'd better show him that the ice won't melt under pressure." "When do you need it?" February, Quebec Conference. The Prime Minister meets with President Roosevelt and the combined Chiefs of Staff. "If we're going to do this, we'll need American cooperation, their industrial capacity, their wood pulp, their engineering support." Mountbatten stands, and the others follow suit. 3 months, Mr. Pike. Show me something impossible." Pike gathers his blueprints, his sample blocks, his calculations. As he moves toward the door, Mountbatten calls after him, "And Geoffrey, don't call it an ice ship anymore. Call it what it is, a berg ship. The Germans respect icebergs. Let them learn to fear them." Outside, London shivers under December rain. Pike walks through blackout streets toward his quarters, mind already racing ahead to refrigeration requirements, construction methodologies, scaling factors. Somewhere in the darkness, air raid sirens begin their nightly wail. He barely notices. In his mind, he sees it already, a vast floating fortress, white and terrible, rising from the Atlantic like something from mythology. Planes lifting from its deck, reaching out across the gap, where convoys now die in darkness. The impossible made real through nothing more than water, wood and cold. 3 months. He has 3 months to build a miracle. January 15th, 1943. Patricia Lake, Jasper National Park, Alberta, Canada. The temperature hovers at -22 degrees Fahrenheit. Ice fog drifts across the frozen lake surface in ghostly sheets, obscuring the Rocky Mountains that ring the valley in jagged silhouettes. Max Perutz crouches beside a hand auger, his breath forming crystalline clouds as he drills through 18 inches of natural lake ice. Beside him, a young Canadian engineer named Bob Kopp marks measurements on a clipboard with fingers so cold he can barely grip the pencil. "How deep?" Perutz asks, his Austrian accent thickened by the cold. 6 feet of water beneath, Kopp replies, checking the depth gauge. Should be enough clearance for the cooling pipes. Around them, the construction site resembles organised chaos. 40 men, civilian workers, military engineers, a handful of scientists swarm across a marked rectangular zone measuring 60 feet by 30 feet. Some operate portable generators that roar and sputter in the frigid air. Others manoeuvre insulated pipes into position, connecting them to compressor units housed in a temporary wooden shelter on shore. Everyone moves with urgent purpose, their faces wrapped in scarves, their movements mechanical in the extreme cold. This is Project Habakkuk's proving ground, not London's conference rooms or Cambridge's laboratories, but this remote Canadian lake, far from prying eyes and German intelligence. Here, beneath the indifferent gaze of snow-covered peaks, Geoffrey Pike's vision will either vindicate itself or collapse into expensive farce. Perutz straightens, his back protesting after hours bent over ice samples. At 30 years old, he's already recognised as one of crystallography's brightest minds. A Jewish refugee who fled Nazi-occupied Austria 4 years earlier, now applying his expertise to one of the war's strangest endeavours. His appointment to the project came directly from Lord Mountbatten after preliminary tests at Cambridge demonstrated pykrite's extraordinary properties. The molecular structure is key, he'd explained to the engineering team during their first meeting in Ottawa 3 weeks earlier. Wood pulp fibres create a matrix within the ice crystal lattice. They prevent crack propagation, distribute stress loads, and significantly reduce thermal conductivity. Think of it as nature's own composite material. We're simply optimizing what glaciers have been doing for millennia. Now comes the test of scaling up. Laboratory samples are one thing. A 60-foot prototype capable of bearing structural loads and proving operational concepts, that's something else entirely. Commander Murray, the Royal Canadian Navy officer overseeing construction, trudges across the ice toward Perutz. Ice clings to his beard, and his eyes are red-rimmed from weeks of 18-hour days. "Dr. Perutz," he calls over the generator noise, "the refrigeration grid is in position, ready for the first freeze." They move together toward the marked rectangle. Within it, workers have erected an elaborate wooden framework, essentially a massive mould, anchored through the natural lake ice to the water below. The structure descends 20 feet beneath the surface and rises 10 feet above it. Refrigeration pipes snake throughout the framework in precise geometric patterns, each connection sealed and pressure tested. The design calls for freezing the pykrete in layers, building the structure gradually to prevent thermal stress fractures. "Water to pulp ratio?" Murray asks. 14 to 1, Perutz confirms. "We've tested ratios from 10 to 1 through 20 to 1. 14 provides optimal strength to weight characteristics. Higher pulp concentrations make the material stronger, but significantly more expensive. Lower concentrations compromise structural integrity." The wood pulp arrives in massive bales from a nearby paper mill, tons of it, specially processed to specific fibre lengths. Workers feed it into industrial mixers, where it combines with lake water, creating a slurry that looks disturbingly like grey porridge. This mixture gets pumped through hoses into the wooden framework, filling the space between refrigeration pipes. "Start the compressors," Murray orders. The sound changes immediately. The generator's roar deepens as they take on load, driving the refrigeration compressors. Within the framework, Freon begins circulating through the pipe network, each loop designed to extract heat from the pykrete slurry, pulling temperatures down to -10 Fahrenheit. Nothing appears to happen at first. The slurry remains liquid, grey and uninspiring. But Perutz knows the transformation is beginning at the molecular level. Ice crystals forming around cellulose fibres, lattice structures interlocking, the slow metamorphosis from liquid to solid, from concept to reality. 24 hours for the first layer, he tells Murray. We'll build it up 4 feet at a time, allowing each layer to fully consolidate before adding the next. Total construction time, 6 weeks, assuming weather cooperates. Murray's expression is sceptical. "And if it doesn't cooperate?" "Then we learn valuable lessons about cold weather construction," Perutz replies with dry humour. "Either way, we'll have data. That's the point of this exercise." The point, though everyone present knows it, extends far beyond data collection. This prototype represents Britain's answer to one of the war's most intractable problems. By January 1943, German U-boats have sent over 15 million tonnes of Allied shipping to the bottom of the Atlantic. Convoys lose an average of 20% of their vessels during each crossing. The mathematics are brutal and unsustainable. Britain imports 2/3 of its food, most of its fuel, and virtually all its raw materials. Cut those supply lines conclusively, and the war is over without Germany landing a single soldier on British soil. Aircraft carriers offer the solution: air cover across the entire Atlantic, forcing U-boats to remain submerged where they're slow and vulnerable. But Britain has exactly 7 fleet carriers, most committed to the Mediterranean or Pacific theatres. Building more using conventional methods requires steel that doesn't exist, shipyards that are fully occupied, and 2 years per vessel. Unless Pike is right, unless ice can become steel. The first night passes slowly. Workers rotate in shifts, monitoring temperatures, adjusting compressor output, ensuring pipe connections don't freeze and rupture. Perut sleeps in 3-hour intervals in a cabin near the shore, waking repeatedly to check readings, to consult with night shift engineers, to verify that the picrete is freezing uniformly. By dawn on January 16th, the first layer has solidified. Perut examines core samples under a portable microscope set up in the heated workshop cabin. The crystal structure looks perfect. Ice matrix reinforced with evenly distributed cellulose fibres, no significant air pockets or separation. He allows himself a moment of satisfaction before heading back into the cold. Day follows day. The prototype grows in vertical increments, each new layer of slurry poured and frozen atop the previous one. The wooden framework rises higher as construction progresses, scaffolding added to allow workers access to the upper levels. The structure begins to dominate the frozen lake, a massive rectangular block of white-grey picrete, ribbed with refrigeration pipes, looming against the mountain backdrop. By late January, the basic hull section stands complete, 60 feet long, 30 feet wide, 20 feet thick. The wooden forms are carefully removed, revealing the picrete beneath. Solid, dense, its surface slightly rough from the freeze process, but structurally sound. Perutz runs his hand along the hull, feeling the cold radiate through his heavy glove. Like concrete, he murmurs, dense as concrete, but frozen from water and wood. The testing begins immediately. First, load-bearing capacity. Workers stack increasingly heavy weights on the prototype's upper surface: sandbags, steel drums, construction equipment. The picrete doesn't flex, doesn't crack. They pile on 10 tons, then 20, then 30. The structure holds firm. Compressive strength exceeds specifications, COP reports, recording measurements. No deflection at 30 tons distributed load. Next comes thermal testing. Engineers use blowtorches to simulate battle damage, heating sections of the hull to determine melt rates and structural compromise. The picrete proves remarkably resistant. Unlike ordinary ice, which would melt rapidly under direct flame, the composite material chars slightly as the wood fibres burn, but maintains structural integrity. The refrigeration system compensates, pulling temperatures back down once the heat source is removed. Self-healing, in a sense, Perutz observes. Localized damage doesn't propagate through the structure. But the most dramatic test comes on February 3rd, with representatives from National Research Council of Canada and the British Admiralty present to observe. Murray has arranged for explosive charges, simulating torpedo warheads, to be detonated against the prototype's hull. The observers gather at a safe distance on the shore. Perutz stands beside Commander Murray and Dr. C.J. Mackenzie, President of the National Research Council, watching through field glasses as demolition specialists position charges against the picrete hull. The charges represent half-pound TNT equivalents, scaled down from full torpedo warheads, but sufficient to demonstrate the material's response to explosive shock. "Fire in the hole!" The warning echoes across the frozen lake. The detonation is sharp and violent. A geyser of ice crystals and snow erupts from the blast point, the shock wave rippling across the lake surface, sending cracks skittering through the natural ice surrounding the prototype. Birds startle from distant trees, wheeling against the grey sky. When the debris settles, the observers approach cautiously. The pykrete hull bears a crater approximately 3 feet deep and 5 feet across. Significant damage, certainly, but nothing like the catastrophic rupture that would result from a similar blast against a conventional steel hull. The crater's edges are well defined, the surrounding material intact. No cracks radiate outward. The structure holds. Extraordinary, Mackenzie breathes. A steel hull would have fragmented completely. Perutz examines the blast site closely, chipping away loose material to reveal the undamaged pykrete beneath. The cellular structure absorbs the shock. Energy dissipates through the mass rather than propagating as fracture lines. And because water is essentially incompressible, the expansion wave from the explosion has nowhere to go. It expends itself, creating the crater rather than rupturing the hull. Murray is grinning beneath his frost-covered beard. This is what we show them in Quebec. The Quebec conference looms just days away, the critical meeting where Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt will determine the allocation of Allied resources for the coming year. Mountbatten plans to present Project Habakkuk directly to both leaders, using the Patricia Lake prototype as proof of concept. But Perutz knows the prototype, impressive as it is, tells only part of the story. The real challenge lies in scaling up another 100-fold, from a 60-foot test section to a 2,000-foot operational vessel. The engineering problems multiply exponentially: refrigeration capacity, structural distribution systems, propulsion, docking facilities, maintenance protocols, each problem solvable in theory. But theory has a way of collapsing when confronted with reality's complications. On February 7th, fresh orders arrive by telegraph from London. Mountbatten wants photographic documentation of the prototype's performance, images suitable for presentation to heads of state and military chiefs. Perutz spends the next day coordinating with military photographers, staging demonstrations that showcase pykrete's properties. They photograph men standing on the prototype, dozens of them, their combined weight irrelevant to the structure beneath. They photograph the torpedo damage, with measuring tapes clearly showing the crater's limited depth. They photograph core samples under microscopic magnification, revealing the fibre-reinforced crystal matrix. And in one memorable sequence, they photograph a worker attacking the pykrete with an axe, the tool bouncing off the surface, barely chipping the material, while natural ice beside it shatters under similar blows. These images will make the journey to Quebec, will be passed between Churchill and Roosevelt, will influence decisions about allocating resources worth billions of dollars. Perutz understands the weight of that responsibility. Science in wartime isn't pure research, it's advocacy, persuasion, the marshalling of evidence to support strategic decisions made by men who will never set foot in a laboratory. The night before the documentation package ships to London, Perutz stands alone on the frozen lake, looking up at the prototype that has consumed the last 6 weeks of his life. The structure looms against the star-filled sky, massive and improbable. Moonlight reflects off its surface, making the pykrete gleam like polished marble. He thinks about the full-scale vessel that might someday rise from these experiments, a floating fortress 2,000 feet long, displacing nearly 2 million tons, carrying hundreds of aircraft across the Atlantic Gap. He thinks about the convoys it could protect, the lives it might save, the strategic balance it could shift. He also thinks about all the things that could go wrong. The refrigeration systems failing in warmer waters, structural fatigue from wave action, the sheer logistical impossibility of constructing something so massive under combat conditions. The prototype before him represents controlled conditions, unlimited time, optimal circumstances. War offers none of these luxuries. But tonight, beneath the Canadian stars, with the prototype standing solid and undeniable behind him, Perutz allows himself to believe that perhaps Pike's mad vision isn't mad at all, that perhaps they've found a way to turn water into walls, to freeze the ocean into runways, to build aircraft carriers from the substance of storms. Tomorrow, the evidence travels to Quebec. Tomorrow, the admirals and generals and political leaders will weigh the impossible against the necessary and make their judgments. Tonight, the prototype stands. That at least is real. August 14, 1943, Chateau Frontenac, Quebec City, Canada. The grand ballroom of the historic hotel has been transformed into a strategic command centre. Maps cover every wall: Europe, the Pacific, North Africa, the Atlantic sea lanes marked with coloured pins tracking convoys, enemy positions, projected operations. Winston Churchill stands near a window overlooking the St. Lawrence River, cigar clenched between his teeth, his characteristic scowl deepening as he reviews a stack of technical documents. Lord Louis Mountbatten waits nearby, his presentation materials arranged on a long table, photographs from Patricia Lake, engineering specifications, cost projections, timeline estimates. Beside these sit two objects that have travelled thousands of miles for this moment: a block of pykrete and, for comparison, an identical-sized block of standard ice. 2 million tonnes, Churchill mutters, not looking up from the papers. The displacement of 40 Queen Elizabeths. You're asking me to approve the construction of a vessel that would be, by substantial margin, the largest moving object ever created by human hands. Yes, Prime Minister, Mountbatten replies calmly, made of ice. Pykrete, sir, a composite material substantially different from... I can read, Louis. Churchill's eyes flick up, sharp and penetrating. The question isn't whether this pykrete material has interesting properties. Your man Perutz has demonstrated that adequately. The question is whether we can build an operational warship from it before the war ends, and whether doing so represents the best use of desperately limited resources. The door opens, admitting President Franklin Roosevelt in his wheelchair, pushed by an aide. Fleet Admiral Ernest King follows, his face set in the expression of permanent skepticism that has become his trademark. Behind them come Air Chief Marshal Charles Portal and General George Marshall, their presence turning the meeting into a full session of the combined Chiefs of Staff. Roosevelt manoeuvres his chair to the table, examining the pykrete block with undisguised curiosity. So this is the famous unsinkable ice. Louis, you've been promising me a demonstration. Mountbatten picks up the standard ice block first. Mr. President, conventional ice. He lets it rest on the table for a moment, then lifts it overhead and drops it. The block shatters spectacularly against the floor, fragments skittering across polished wood in every direction. Now, pykrete, Mountbatten lifts the composite block, repeats the overhead drop. The block hits with a solid thunk and remains intact. A few small chips break free, but the mass holds together. He picks it up, shows the undamaged surface to Roosevelt. Impressive party trick, Admiral King observes dryly. How does it fare against actual weapons? I'm glad you asked, Admiral. Mountbatten produces a service pistol from his briefcase, a move that causes several security personnel to tense visibly. With the Prime Minister's permission? Churchill waves his cigar. By all means, though I'd prefer you didn't shoot any of us. Mountbatten aims at the remaining piece of standard ice resting on the table. The shot cracks through the room and the ice explodes exactly as it had at the London demonstration 6 months earlier. Fragments spray across the table. Now observe. He aims at the pykrete block. The bullet strikes, ricochets at a sharp angle and embeds itself in the wooden ceiling beam above their heads with a sharp thwack. Everyone in the room instinctively ducks, everyone except Mountbatten, who stands calmly examining the pykrete block. It bears only a small indentation where the bullet struck. Good God, Roosevelt exclaims, looking between the ceiling and the block. The thing's bulletproof? Not bulletproof, sir. The bullet did penetrate slightly, but it absorbs impact energy rather than fragmenting. A torpedo striking a 40-foot thick pykrete hull would create localized damage but couldn't rupture the vessel. Unlike steel, which transmits explosive force throughout its structure, pykrete contains the damage to the immediate impact zone. General Marshall leans forward, studying the photographs from Patricia Lake. Your prototype demonstrated this? Extensively, General. We detonated explosive charges equivalent to scaled-down torpedo warheads. The results exceeded our projections. The test hull sustained damage but maintained complete structural integrity. Churchill has moved to the wall maps, tracing the Atlantic convoy routes with one finger. The gesture is unconscious, born from hundreds of hours spent in war rooms contemplating this same problem. The gap, the killing zone, the stretch of ocean where U-boats reign supreme, and merchant ships die by the dozens. The strategic argument is sound, he says quietly. Air cover across the entire Atlantic would fundamentally alter the calculus of the submarine war. The question, gentlemen, is whether we can actually build these Berg ships in meaningful numbers before the war's outcome is decided through other means. Admiral King picks up the specifications document, his expression growing increasingly doubtful as he reads. Construction timeline estimates 6 months for the first vessel, assuming ideal conditions. By ideal conditions, I presume you mean Arctic waters, no enemy interference, unlimited access to materials and labour. The first vessel would indeed require optimal circumstances, Mountbatten acknowledges. Subsequent ships, once we've refined the construction process, would require the same optimal circumstances, King interrupts. Admiral, I've built ships my entire career. I know what happens when theoretical timelines meet practical reality. Your 6 months becomes 12. 12 becomes 18. Meanwhile, you're diverting resources. Steel for refrigeration equipment, copper for electrical systems, skilled engineers, construction workers, all of which we desperately need for conventional shipbuilding programs that we know will work. Air Chief Marshal Portal joins the debate. The aircraft capacity is certainly attractive. 300 planes per vessel, you say? Potentially more, Mountbatten replies. The flight deck is 2,000 feet long, longer than any conventional carrier. We could operate heavy bombers from these platforms, not just fighters and torpedo aircraft. Heavy bombers, Portal's tone is thoughtful. That opens interesting possibilities for mid-Atlantic anti-submarine patrols. B-24 Liberators operating from floating bases, covering the entire gap. He trails off, calculating ranges and coverage zones in his head. Roosevelt has been quiet, listening to the exchange, his politician's instincts reading the room's mood. Winston, he says finally, what does your gut tell you about this? Churchill removes the cigar from his mouth, contemplates it for a moment. My gut, Franklin, tells me that Geoffrey Pike is either a genius or a madman, and I'm not entirely certain the two categories are mutually exclusive. He turns from the map, facing the assembled officers. However, my gut also tells me that we're losing the Atlantic. Slowly, perhaps. Not catastrophically, not yet. But the trends are unfavourable, and trends in warfare have a way of accelerating when you least expect it. He moves to the table, picks up the pykrete block, hefts its weight. This material is real. The prototype is real. The question is whether we have the time, resources, and, let's be honest, the audacity to pursue this at scale. There's another consideration, General Marshall interjects. Conventional carrier construction is accelerating. American shipyards are producing escort carriers at increasing rates. The British are converting merchant hulls. By mid-1944, we'll have significantly improved air coverage over the Atlantic without building ice ships. Escort carriers, Mountbatten counters, with perhaps 20 aircraft each, operating single-engine fighters with limited range. A Habakkuk vessel would carry 15 times that number, including heavy bombers with 1,000-mile operational radii. The scales aren't comparable. Neither are the risks, King shoots back. You're asking us to gamble enormous resources on an untested technology. Yes, your prototype worked under controlled conditions in a Canadian lake with constant monitoring and maintenance. An operational Berg ship would face Atlantic storms, temperature variations, battle damage, mechanical failures. What happens when the refrigeration system fails mid-ocean? When ice fatigue develops in the hull after 6 months of wave action? When you need to dock this monster for repairs and there isn't a dry dock in the world large enough to accommodate it? The questions hang in the air, unanswerable with present data. Mountbatten has responses, theoretical responses, engineering solutions, contingency plans, but he knows the fundamental truth that King is driving at. They would be pioneering an entirely new category of naval engineering while simultaneously fighting a global war. Roosevelt wheels himself closer to the window, gazing out at the St. Lawrence. "How much?" he asks simply. "Total program cost, best estimate." Mountbatten consults his documents. For a single prototype vessel, approximately $70 million. For a production run of 10 vessels, assuming construction efficiencies, approximately $500 million total. $500 million, King repeats. That's 24 Essex-class carriers, proven technology, known capabilities, available in 18 months. Available in the Pacific Theatre, Mountbatten points out, where they're desperately needed against Japan. Habakkuk vessels would free up conventional carriers for Pacific operations while solving the Atlantic problem. The debate continues for another hour, circling the same fundamental points: revolutionary potential versus enormous risk, strategic advantage versus resource allocation, the seduction of the innovative against the reliability of the proven. Finally, Churchill raises his hand for silence. "Gentlemen, I propose a compromise. We authorise preliminary design work, full engineering specifications, detailed construction planning, cost refinement. Louis, your combined operations will coordinate with the Americans to identify potential construction sites, likely in Canadian Arctic waters. We'll allocate funds for this planning phase, but not for actual construction. We reconvene in 6 months to review the completed plans and make a final decision based on more complete information." Roosevelt nods slowly. "That seems prudent. Ernest, George, can you live with that?" King's expression suggests he's swallowed something bitter, but he nods. "Planning only. No construction authorization without another full review." Marshall agrees as well, though he adds, "And this planning work cannot interfere with existing carrier programs or Liberty ship production. Secondary priority only." "Agreed," Churchill says. He looks at Mountbatten. "Louis, you have your authorization. Use it wisely." The meeting breaks up, officers dispersing to other sessions, other decisions. Mountbatten gathers his materials, carefully packing the Pykrete block back into its insulated container. Roosevelt wheels himself over before departing. "That was quite a show with the pistol," the President says quietly, "though I notice you didn't mention that the ricochet nearly took off Charles Portal's ear." Mountbatten allows himself a slight smile. "The demonstration was effective, Mr. President." "It was, but effective demonstrations don't always translate to effective weapons." Roosevelt's voice carries the weight of experience, of watching countless miracle weapons fail to deliver on their promises. "Build me complete plans, Louis. Show me exactly how this gets done, what it costs, how long it really takes. Then we'll see." "Yes, sir." After Roosevelt leaves, Churchill approaches, cigar smoke wreathing his head. "You know this won't happen, don't you?" he says bluntly. "Oh, we'll spend the money on planning. Your engineers will produce beautiful blueprints. But by the time those plans are complete, the war will have moved on. Either we'll be winning the Atlantic through conventional means, or we'll have already lost it." "Perhaps, Prime Minister." "No, perhaps about it." Churchill claps him on the shoulder. "But that's not entirely the point, is it? The point is that we forced ourselves to think differently, to imagine solutions outside the conventional framework. Even if Habakkuk never gets built, the exercise of conceiving it, that has value. It keeps our minds flexible, stops us from becoming prisoners of orthodox thinking." He starts to leave, then pauses. "And who knows? Perhaps I'm wrong. Perhaps 6 months from now, the strategic situation will be so desperate that building aircraft carriers from ice will seem like the sanest option available. God help us if it comes to that." Mountbatten watches him go, then turns to the window, looking out at the same river Roosevelt had contemplated. Somewhere beyond that river lies the Atlantic. And beyond the Atlantic, Britain, sustained by convoy ships that run a gauntlet of submarines, kept alive by a lifeline that grows more tenuous each month. In his mind, he sees it still, the vast berg ship, white and impossible, its deck thronged with aircraft, its hull impervious to torpedoes. He sees the strategic map redrawn, the Atlantic rendered safe, the siege of Britain broken through nothing more than frozen water and human ingenuity. But Churchill is right. The window is closing. In the months ahead, engineering teams will labour over detailed plans for a vessel that will probably never exist. They'll solve complex refrigeration problems, design innovative hull structures, calculate stress loads and buoyancy factors for a ship made from ice. And by the time those plans are complete, history will have moved past the moment when such desperate measures seemed necessary. By August 1944, exactly 1 year later, the Atlantic battle will have turned decisively in the Allies' favour. New escort carriers, improved sonar, long-range patrol aircraft operating from the Azores and breaking the German naval codes will combine to decimate the U-boat fleet. The gap will close, not through berg ships, but through conventional naval power applied with increasing effectiveness. The Project Habakkuk plans will grow to over 7,000 pages of detailed specifications. Engineers will solve every major technical challenge, proving conclusively that yes, it could be built. A 2 million-tonne aircraft carrier constructed from picrete, capable of operating anywhere in the world's oceans. But that capability will remain theoretical, locked in filing cabinets and classified archives. The Patricia Lake prototype will remain frozen through the winter of 1943 to 44, then be allowed to melt the following spring. Workers will dismantle the refrigeration equipment, salvage the generators and compressors for other uses. The picrete itself will return to water and wood pulp, the molecules dispersing through the lake, leaving behind only pilings and some submerged debris that fishermen will occasionally snag their lines on in years to come. Geoffrey Pike will continue proposing revolutionary schemes throughout the war's remainder: self-propelled barges, airborne invasions, exotic weapon systems. Some will be implemented, most will not. He'll struggle with depression in the post-war years, his brilliant mind increasingly unable to find purchase in a world that has less use for radical innovation. In 1948, he'll take his own life, leaving behind notebooks filled with ideas the world wasn't ready to embrace. Max Perutz will return to Cambridge, applying his understanding of ice crystal structures to the study of protein molecules. His work will eventually earn him a Nobel Prize in chemistry, though he'll rarely mention his wartime service on Project Habakkuk. When asked about it late in life, he'll describe it as a beautiful idea that wasn't needed, perhaps the kindest epitaph any military project could receive. But on this August afternoon in Quebec, those futures remain unknown. Mountbatten packs his briefcase, the picrete block nestled among papers and photographs. Tomorrow, he'll brief junior officers on the planning phase, begin coordinating with Canadian and American engineering teams, set in motion the elaborate design process that will produce those 7,000 pages of specifications. Tonight, though, he allows himself a moment to appreciate what they've accomplished, not the building of a berg ship, but the proving of a principle. That in war, when conventional wisdom offers no solutions, you must be willing to consider the unconventional. That materials dismissed as useless might prove revolutionary when viewed through creative eyes. That the impossible is sometimes just the improbable waiting for someone audacious enough to attempt it. The bullet hole in the ceiling beam will remain for years afterward, a silent testimony to the day when military leaders gathered in a Quebec ballroom and seriously contemplated building aircraft carriers from ice. Workers will eventually notice it during renovations, wonder at its presence, perhaps invent their own stories to explain it. The truth that it came from a demonstration of frozen wood pulp's ballistic properties, part of a proposal to construct the largest moving object in human history, would seem too absurd to believe. Unless you'd been there. Unless you'd seen the prototype standing solid on Patricia Lake, felt the picrete's density, witnessed the material's strange and wonderful properties. Unless you'd glimpsed, however briefly, a future where the Atlantic Ocean itself became a shipyard and icebergs carried wings. That future never came to pass. But for one shining moment in the depths of war, when Britain stood desperate and the Atlantic threatened to become an Axis lake, it seemed not just possible, but necessary. Geoffrey Pike's floating runway idea did indeed provoke laughter, at first. But by the time Project Habakkuk's planning phase concluded, no one was laughing. They were calculating, engineering, problem-solving. They were taking it seriously, because the alternative, dismissing innovation in favour of orthodoxy, was a luxury besieged nations could not afford. The planes never took off from ice runways in the middle of the ocean, but they might have. And in warfare, might have is sometimes victory enough.